This
organization
conference will now be recorded.
for the organization that will help educate our staff and start a conversation regarding these issues. Today, we begin this special program in the hope that we can address these concerns, and I am grateful to Governor Patterson, who agreed to be our inaugural speaker. David Patterson, the former governor of New York State, is currently the Senior Vice President and Senior Advisor to the President and COO of Sands Las Vegas. He joined NYCHSRO MedReview's board in 2017. Governor Patterson brings to the table a vast range of knowledge and experience spanning a 3+ decade career in law, government, politics, business, and broadcast news media. In addition to his governorship from 2008 to 2010, Mr. Patterson served on the board of the Metropolitan Transit Authority in 2012 and was chairman of the New York State Democratic Party from 2014 to 2016. He has been a frequent drive time talk radio host for WORAM and WNYAM in New York City, as well as a guest commentator on nationally broadcast news programs. As governor, he demonstrated his insight and foresight in the challenges facing New York when he predicted the national financial crisis of 2008. He was instrumental in helping to mitigate the financial devastation of New Yorkers during the nationwide collapse. As a result of his leadership, the state kept its credit rating for the duration of his term. Throughout his career in public service, he has been a fighter for racial equality and is an eloquent spokesman on social issues. It is my pleasure to introduce Governor David Patterson.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for that wonderful introduction. Joe and I are good friends outside this process, so I wasn't surprised that he would give me a wonderful introduction. But the poignant message that he delivered prior to what he said about me is one that is a challenge to all of us, and in this conversation is a challenge to me. I want to thank everyone affiliated with NYCHSRO MedReview, the board, the management, the employees, all of you who have taken time out to join us today in what I hope will be a conversation that stimulates us to try to make a difference, which was the message of the late Congressman John Lewis, just buried a few days ago. And I would like to start in a rather unorthodox way of telling a story. It's a story of the men who were known as the Tuskegee Airmen. They were black soldiers who were trained in Tuskegee, Alabama, and whose marksmanship and excellence was just shocked and surprised everybody in the military when they got into the war and flew air raids over Germany, over Italy, and over Japan. The Tuskegee Airmen were an all-black troop. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that they were the best aircraft fighters in the military at that particular time. And I want to have you wonder for a moment, why would these black soldiers be so much better than the white soldiers and anyone else? I mean, we wouldn't think that a race of people would necessarily be that great and excellent in terms of the way they discharged their duties aboard these aircrafts that they flew and destroyed our enemies in World War II. Well, the reason that they were so good was not because they were black. The reason they were so good actually has something to do with racism. So in 1941, when President Roosevelt announced our entry into the war, hurriedly many soldiers were sent to Tuskegee, Alabama, and other places to learn firebombing from the air as America understood what France did not understand in World War II, which the French thought was a turf war in like World War I. But the Germans were fighting with aircrafts and bombing from above, and the United States had to catch up to them. So the soldiers were trained very hurriedly, and between 3 and 6 months, they were deployed into military activity, and they were all white because the black soldiers were believed not to be intelligent enough to fly the aircrafts or manage the difficult equipment or the purpose of flying and shooting at the enemy at the same time. So they were detained at Tuskegee for 2 whole years. Only in late 1941, when things were not going particularly well in the war and many of our great brave soldiers had been shot down, they finally brought the black soldiers in. And the reason they were so much better wasn't because they were black, but because they'd had 2 to 2.5 years of training as opposed to 3 to 6 months that their white comrades had had before being sent directly into the war. So most times when people tell stories of racism, the result is pretty negative. In other words, because of racism, someone couldn't get a job. Because of racism, people weren't allowed to move into different communities or go to schools that they wanted. But in this case, because of racism, the extra practice and the duration of it brought the greatest fire bombers and aircraft firefighters that the country had ever seen. The purpose of the story was really to inform all of us that racism dictates and pervades every form of life, from education to housing, to employment, to business interaction, to walking down the street peacefully, and even to the military, because the military had such restrictive segregation in it that many black soldiers that went to Germany, my uncle being one of them, said that when they captured the German prisoners of war, that they treated them better than their American colleagues who were in the military. So as we look at our gathering today, and it's so great that we could be together, are we going to, over the next period of time, tolerate some of the conditions that we've been forced to live under? Are we going to suffer public officials who make peddle simplistic exaggerations that parody the truth? Or are we going to listen to, at times, people in my old profession, politicians, raise hopes that they can't fulfill or make promises that we can't keep? Or are we really going to act? So I suggest that if we want to find some workable and sensible and achievable goals that will make living for all of us a little bit easier, that we start with a real honest and forthright view of what some of the problems are. And I suggest, why don't we start right now with the elephant in the room, and that is the police department and its relationship with minority communities. Now, the police department and the police officers who live in the suburbs, they live in Long Island and Nassau County, they live in Rockland and Orange and Westchester County. They live in neighborhoods very much like the one that I grew up in. I didn't always live in Harlem. I had to be moved to Long Island when I was school age because the New York City public school system would not have a blind student operating in the classroom in regular conditions. You had to be sent, in my case, it would have been the Lavelle School for the Blind. So I grew up on Long Island, and I saw this. The police officers who worked in New York City, who lived there, they weren't just living in the suburban neighborhoods. They were the people who were bowling next to you at the bowling alley. They were Little League coaches and scoutmasters and deacons at their own church. And the police officers rightly inherit today what the police officers of yesterday set as a tone in their communities as well as the neighborhoods in which they worked. So it is understandable that particularly in trials, that the public is very, very virulent in its desire not to convict an officer of the police department because there's an automatic presumption that the officer is doing his job or the officer was put under so much stress that they had to defend themselves. And I think that's a fair analysis. Now let's turn to the communities where the officers worked up until about 15 to 20 years ago. These are communities of color. There are no police officers in the community because only in the last 20 to 25 years have we had any type of representation in the police department that would be reflective of the population. When the police wanted to do investigations in the neighborhood, they didn't even have black police officers to go undercover for them. So this created automatically a tense relationship between the officers coming into the community and the people who live there, because the only interactions they ever had is when the police were making an arrest. So you didn't have the types of situations now where police officers from the NYPD go to the offices of elected officials and they sit down and talk to the elected officials about their neighborhoods, where the hot spots, where the strong crime areas, how do we get the cooperation of the people who live in there. Often each precinct has a precinct advisory council now that are composed of citizens from the neighborhood. We didn't have that then. So what would happen, and it happens in any institution, it doesn't matter whether it's politics or government, even in our faith-based institutions, the police had ultimate power in these communities. And therefore, they're even walking around past the residents there was a difficult situation, because whenever the police showed up, the residents were fearful because of, though they were few, the many incidents when police used excessive force. So against that backdrop, the best change would have to come from the concept that because the police are overworked, they are underpaid, they are put in very difficult situations, and almost any time they put on the uniform, their life is in danger. This, I think, is something we would all accept. But what's also true is because of the loyalty that is manifested in being under that type of duress, there has been a policy, not written, but known in the police department, that if another police officer goes beyond their scope of duty, or God forbid breaks the law, that you're not allowed to report them. You're not allowed to say anything about that. And that has created a tremendous problem. And you see it in the George Floyd video when the 3 other police officers looked on as he lay dying on the street. This type of policing cannot be allowed to exist anymore. It would be just as dangerous as if we said, well, there are always a few bad apples in every profession. If the bad apples are in the airline industry, we would not want to risk aircraft disasters because the pilots are unfit to be in that seat. And we can't allow police officers who don't discharge their duties with the professionalism that the public rightly deserves as taxpayers. We're going to have to address it. So these shrill cries that I hear asking for the defunding of the police department honestly make me happy that I'm out of the process right now, because I would publicly say, and I guess I'm publicly saying it today, that that is about the most antagonistic idea to what we're trying to relieve as we could think of. Defunding the police is not going to solve the problem. Actually, additional training in the police force, a different policy about what happens to police officers who witness actions committed by other police officers and are derelict in their duty by not reporting it, is really the way to do that. And that would probably involve more money. Now, under the pandemic we have right now, I don't know any agency that's going to get more money, but I would argue that the police department should not get less, because the New York City Police Department has made a number of adjustments over the years that I think are noteworthy, even though there's more to do. So that brings us just to the whole sense of how we live and how we treat each other and how we understand each other's issues. And I think that the biggest problem in the movement for civil rights is that I don't think many Americans realize how much our history and our government is derived from interaction with African Americans. Our founding Constitution, under Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, provides for slavery. It also provides in Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, the opportunity to recover runaway slaves. That section is still in the Constitution if you open your a Constitution book and look at it. This happened in 1787. Every decision that the early American government made related to the slaves and African Americans, from the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 to the Missouri Compromise in 1820 to the Compromise of 1850 when California was made a free state, Texas was a slave state, Utah and New Mexico remained neutral territories, and slavery was abolished in the District of Columbia. So the issues in the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the Dred Scott decision of 1857, and even the Civil War itself, while the real problem was that the South wanted more tax credits for slaves. And the reason that slaves were listed as 3/5 of a man at the time is because the South wanted them counted as part of the population to get more electoral votes. So the state of Virginia, which had 1/4 the population of whites as it did in Pennsylvania, had equal number of electoral votes because they counted the slaves, and all those 3/5 added up to an even electoral process between Virginia and Pennsylvania. Our Declaration of Independence described slavery as the greatest woe to mankind. Thomas Jefferson wrote it, but in a negotiation, in a coalition of New England slave traders and Southern planters, that statement did not make the final cut of our Constitution. So most of us believe that after the Civil War and after the Reconstruction era, that things changed. They didn't change at all. In 1900, in a city known as Helena, Montana, it's the capital of Montana, 4.5% of that population were African Americans who were business leaders. They were traders on the stock market, and they did very well and were starting to displace some of their white neighbors in the more elite sections of the city. The process of zoning removed the African Americans, in many ways took all of their privileges away from them, and by 1920, there were very few African Americans still living in Helena, Montana. The population was 1%. The population right now, as we speak, 20 years, 100 years later, is 0.03% of the Montana population. We just recognized the 100th anniversary of a purge, a slaughter, basically a government pogrom that was committed against black citizens in Oklahoma City who lived in a neighborhood known as the Black Wall Street because of the success of their businesses and their properties. Over 300 people died in that conflict, one that remained rather unknown through history until really the last 30 to 40 years. And in 1917, the Supreme Court of the United States, and you may be surprised to hear this, ruled that public money used to promote segregation was illegal. Now, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896 said that separate but equal was acceptable. But the 1917 case said you couldn't do that anymore. And that's when different government types of maneuvers were utilized to segregate black people in all states in this country, not just the South. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled in a case known as Shelley v. Kramer that racially restrictive covenants could not be used by government. In other words, you couldn't say, this is a white neighborhood and no blacks can come in. Once again, zoning and something called urban renewal was instituted by the federal government, and this is why you found by the mid-50s most African Americans living in the same place because the zoning laws prohibited them from living anyplace else. This is also when the idea that school districts would be tied to the real estate in that district. So your school taxes go up and down based on the performance of your schools, the attendance of the students included. That whole system developed to keep African Americans away from whites that didn't desire to live near them. Now we're moving into a period of time where most of us were born. So what I'm really trying to get everyone to see is it wasn't just that people were mean to each other. It just wasn't because people didn't like each other. It's because the government all the way participated in these types of voter suppression, in segregating population, even after the 1964 Civil Rights Act through zoning. And this is the reason why we still have this sort of crucible around our necks as Americans today. And there are so many people that we have to thank over the last basically 250 years, our ancestors, both the living and the dead, both black and white, who have fought unremittingly and courageously, I would think, to build a nation that would bring economic, political, and social justice for all of us. Those, I think, should still be our aims. Those should be our principles, and I pray that we never stray from them. Now, as was the case in the civil rights demonstrations of the 60s, antagonists, criminals, people who do not believe in democracy, utilize the protest to inevitably commit violence, commit looting, commit arson, and to make the protests appear that they were designed to create the violence that ensued. Right here in New York City, I think it should be noted that the crime rate started to spike here in the city in May. The George Floyd death occurred on May 25th. It was already spiking. And the reason it was spiking, and I don't think we can blame anyone for this, is the fact that because we were quarantining, because we were sheltering, and because we were trying to curb the coronavirus, we took large groups of young people out of school. They couldn't use the parks. They couldn't play basketball. There were no after-school programs. There was no civilized way for them to interact, which always opens the most vulnerable to them to gangs, to drug use, to drug trafficking, to robbery and looting, and all of the situations that we witnessed. And this is in no way making up any kind of excuse for that conduct. Anyone engages it should be arrested and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But what it did do to a certain extent is to muffle the message of the legitimate protests. And I saw a protest on television last night in a different city where somebody started a fire and the other protesters put it out. And that was the struggle that Dr. Martin Luther King always had, because there were always subversives trying to turn his peaceful protests into violence. And let's just remember that some of it was coming from the Communist Party, because the Communist Party infiltrated Dr. King's movement on several occasions, and he fought to keep them out because he didn't want to replace the American society with a society that was even more repressive. But also, records showed years later that the FBI's COINTEL project under its director, J. Edgar Hoover, actually recruited African Americans to go in and stir up trouble in cities that were turbulent because of unequal treatment and where there were civil rights marches. In fact, the Watts riots of 1967 were started by one man. His name was Dothard Perry. He was not a communist. He was not a civil rights worker. He was an undercover agent by the FBI who set the Watts Arts and Culture Theater on fire to enrage the community because he left Ku Klux Klan literature outside the arson. And that is what ignited the Watts riot. So there are a lot of forces in this country that are antagonistic and antithetical to the progress of people and bringing people, whether they be Asian, Black, Hispanic, or white, whether they be people of wealth or people who are on social services. Right here in the city, we have homeowners, we have tenants, we have cooperators, and even the homeless. And in spite of the perceived problems inherent in our differences, I think that we can go a long way if we start to think about who we are, and what we can be. And I think that also it's important to understand that the original civil rights movement in this country has expanded to represent the LGBT communities, the Jewish communities, the Hispanic communities, Asian communities, anybody, and the disabled communities. Anyone who's not getting unequal treatment is getting treatment that is antithetical to what was written in our founding constitution and what we've amended several times. So it's my view that as we look to the future in this type of environment, with a virus that we thought might end during the summer and it didn't, a virus that we thought we had curbed here in New York and then it started to spike again, and obviously around the country, the number of deaths over 160,000 from the virus, and no vaccine that we know to be in sight. Our economy is derived 70% from community spending, but no one can spend because nobody can go to any of the venues where people spend, and so many people have lost work, they don't have the money to spend at all. And also, we've had the racial strife that's continued in some of our cities. It's the 69th day of protest in Portland, Oregon. But I think the best way to start is to understand that we're all alike. In spite of our perceived differences, we're all alike. The reason we're all alike is because we came from the same place. None of us came from, as far as we know, other planets or solar systems. We came from here. We are the collective end of something that was started years ago. And though our religions may differ and our spirituality may wonder as to how we all got here, we are more similar than different. And we go through the same challenges. I remember sitting in a law firm in 1978. I was a summer intern at Strzok & Levan, and it had a large number of Jewish lawyers there. One day we were all eating lunch, and they all started talking about how they'd applied to another law firm, which was apparently a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant firm known as Sherman and Sterling, and how no matter what their credentials were, they never got hired there. And I thought to myself, wow, I could close my eyes and think that I'm back home and my parents and their friends are talking about the discrimination that they received. So it feels bad when it's you, whoever you are, wherever you came from, and whatever God you worship. But the reality is, it has been the crucible of this country. And I think that the answer lies in some of the work that has been done in Germany since the Holocaust that I think needs to be replicated over here, where the country took responsibility for what the leadership of the country did in World War II and committing the Holocaust, killing 6 million people. All of them happened to be Jewish, and that was how they wanted it to be. But what we need to do in this country is to really go back and examine how we have treated people even after we've passed laws that were designed to free them for that treatment. I think we should bring, rather than taking down all these statues, we should put up a statue right near the Lincoln Memorial honoring the slaves who actually built this country, none of whose names we really ever knew. I think there are so many ways that we, rather than thinking about the ways to create an eye and an eye for a tooth for a tooth or whatever it is, that we should be thinking more in terms of how to admit and how to understand and how to be able to condemn the actions of our own country. I hear people talk about slavery and they say, I wasn't there, I didn't have anything to do with it, I don't know why you're blaming this on me. Well, what's interesting is when they talk about other times in American history, like the Revolutionary War, they say, we won the Revolutionary War. We won the War of 1812. The North says we won the Civil War. But yet, when it comes to slavery, there's this amnesia. And I think the best way to sanitize ourselves, the spiritual way that we can be more in touch with each other, is to admonish ourselves, not other people, for the wrongs that have been committed by the greatest country in the world. But great people have great flaws, and great countries have had great flaws, and we've had them. And if we do that, then I think there is a great, great time ahead of us. I'll just close by telling you a story about a rabbi who asked his rabbinical students if they could identify when dawn occurs. And one of the students raised his hand and he said, I think dawn occurs when you can see the imprint of your hand if you hold it up in front of you. And the rabbi said, that's a nice answer, but that's not what I'm looking for. Another gentleman in the rabbinical class raised his hand and he said, I think dawn occurs when you can tell the difference between, in the woods, the face of a dog and the face of a lamb. Very interesting, the rabbi said, but that's not what I'm interested in. And finally, the third person said, I think dawn occurs not by something you see, but something you hear, and it's the sound of the birds chirping. He said, very creative, but not what I'm looking for. And finally, they all threw up their hands and asked the rabbi what he was looking for, and he said, dawn occurs when we look into the eyes of all of the people around us and realize that they are our brothers and sisters. Until that moment, we're all asleep and we are in darkness. Thank you very much.
Governor, I certainly want to thank you for your enlightening presentation, and I think it would be appropriate to now open up for any questions that anyone wants to ask the governor. Again, on behalf of NYCHSRO MedReview, Governor, we thank you for your presentation.
And everybody, there is a chat box. If you click on there, you can enter your question. So please type in your question if you have it, and then we will relay it to the governor. So feel free to enter any questions you have into the chat box. Got a couple. We've got a couple of comments. So we have a comment from one of our employees that says, "This is awesome. Thank you so much. We need a renewal of the mind from the inside out and from top to bottom. Re-educating the staff this way will make a long-term difference in our lives and work environment. Thank you." And then somebody else said,
"Thank you for that.
Free, very interesting and informative. I learned a lot I did not already know." And then another comment, "Thank you, Governor. This was great. I hope you come back and speak to us again soon. Very educational."
If anyone else wants to put in a comment or a question, please feel free to do so now.
Here you have another comment. It says, "Thank you for your words of advice and wisdom. Can you give me some advice on what is the best way to help with Black Lives Matter?"
Well, Black Lives Matter is an organization that's very strident, and they are having a march in August. And my understanding is that they have not invited the traditional civil rights organizations, nor have they invited the churches to participate in this march. So this has happened before. This happened in the 60s when the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that was everything but nonviolent, was operating, and they put a lot of pressure on Dr. King with that kind of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth strategy. And Dr. King held firm to his to his desire not to embrace any kind of violence. And so, I think the unfortunate aspect to Black Lives Matter is not some of the things that have been said, but the fact that some people have been saying what Black Lives Matter has said, but in a more conversational way as to try to make change through negotiation and dialogue. And yet, whenever somebody goes out and does something really antagonistic, they get far more media attention. And oddly enough, that's when the door gets opened to allow the reasonable people to come in and try to settle differences. So I think that, many of the Black Lives Matter people are younger. Many of them have some pretty strong views about things, and I think in a democracy that's fine. When I was governor, I actually was willing to allow a group. I can't remember their name right now. They don't even need them anymore, but they were pretty strident at the time, but very conservative. And we let them use a state park to convey their message because it is a democracy and everyone has an opinion. What I do think and hope is one thing that happened during the civil rights movement in the 60s, and I don't think it's going to happen now as much because of the virus as anything else. During that time, all that debate and the argument about the Vietnam War, at that point in American history, we had the highest registration in colleges and the lowest dropout rate in high schools as we ever had in our country. And I hope that people who want to debate these issues and want to hold rallies and want to speak will at the same time take the time to learn from history so that they don't duplicate some of the antisocial rhetoric that always gets in the way of people hearing what you want to change in our society.
So the next question, it comes from Dr. McGarvey, one of your fellow board members. It says,
I knew he would
David.
save me. I knew he would save me.
And he did. He says, brilliant, David. Thanks so much. You are basically calling for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Could you please provide more details about how that might be created?
Well, Nick, I've got to tell you, I wasn't thinking about that when I said it today, but that's exactly what it is. When you think about the fact that Nelson Mandela, only 1 year into his service, after all of the ravage and the brutality, and Nelson Mandela's war was violent because in this case, every time they'd hold a rally, the police would come and shoot, in one case, 60 people in one of the rallies in Cape Town. So he brought the same people together in hearing rooms and had them testify to how they felt, how they would live in the new society. And so maybe with Dr. McGarvey's help, I will think of a way to do it here. But it's exactly, I guess, what I was referring to, which is that we've got to kind of take responsibility, not just as people, but our government caused more problems even when the Supreme Court gave dicta and decided cases one way. They utilized the power of government to create little commissions and dissect people, as I said before, through what was called zoning and urban renewal, which had a nickname in the Black community called Negro removal. And so I'm going to give a little more thought to that, Nick, and I'll get back to you and everyone else.
Great. We have another employee just left a comment. It says, on a personal note, I attended both the rally against anti-Semitism on January 5th and the BLM rally in June. We have another comment and question that says, thank you, Governor, for your time and amazing history lesson. What are some steps we can possibly start applying to uproot systemic racism in the workplace?
Well, I think this is a step. I don't think there's systemic racism at NYCHSRO MedReview, But I think that people getting an opportunity to talk to each other. I remember when I worked for a municipal credit union, I was 21 years old, right down on William Street. And what happened is that the white employees would tell these racially charged jokes. And when we told one, somebody would get reported to management. So that's how, far away we were from each other at that time. And finally, we had a meeting and expressed our views, and we were listened to in that case, I must say. But I think this all kind of speaks to spending a little more time trying to understand people when they are explaining something to you about themselves, because most of the times they're telling the truth. And I think in terms of the police activities, because the police themselves were denied the opportunity to really get to understand that 90% of these communities they were sent in, whether it was the South Bronx or Harlem, were communities where the people were law abiding. And they were watching the way they treated everyone as if they were not law abiding. And I think this is where the dialogue with them. I remember when some of the new police officers from the 28th precinct in Harlem came to my office, and I said, "How many are you from Long Island?" And I think 10 of the 12 people's hands went up. And I said, "Well, guess what? So am I." So you're going to hear a conversation from me that you won't hear from anyone else. When I moved to Harlem, right after I got out of Columbia University in the early 70s, I was totally afraid because of all the things I heard, and yet I met the most wonderful people. I mean, not all of them, but the most wonderful people, to the point that I'm happy to call that my residence for the rest of my life.
We have another comment. It says, "It has been an honor to hear from the governor. I appreciate the ability to listen in today and look forward to hearing from future speakers. Thanks so much." We had another question, Amen, that asked what you think about the players that are kneeling during the national anthem.
Well, this is kind of interesting because my usual way of doing things is when someone is conducting a ceremony, I respect it. So if it's a national anthem, and I know that it wasn't always the home of the brave and the land of the free, particularly, but I think the national anthem, like all anthems, it's a pledge. This is what we want, that it's futuristic. So I do think that kneeling could, in that respect, be considered not to be consistent with the respect you would show, before a football game or a dinner or something like that. At the same time, the question is, where is the venue where people want to listen? And unless we can come up with the venue where people get to express what they feel has been unfair, what they see that they find to be unequal, then we're going to have to live with the fact that they're going to do it at ball games and, in some respects, mix politics with the event that's about to occur. And we don't necessarily want to do that. But let's just remember that Dr. King, when he conducted the sit-ins, he was blocking people from going into their businesses. And it was an inconvenience, and it was breaking the law. But I think it's what Congressman John Conyers called later good trouble. In other words, as long as you're not mocking people or yelling things out, if you just kneel in silence and then go back to your regular position and enjoy the event, I think that we can live with that. Although I would say that that I have, whenever I was at some event, tried to respect the wishes of the people who were putting the event on.
Thank you. And so we have another comment. It says, "Thank you. When trying to find the end of the thread of our original sim, it seems just out of reach. Does it begin with Native American slaves and genocide, the African, Caribbean, Mexican, Chinese, and South American slave trade, the Mexicans and Chinese who died building our railroads and were lynched routinely in massive numbers, indentured servants, the Japanese internment camps, I find that I can't breathe. Is it better, perhaps, as you suggest in closing, to remember that we all come from the same stardust?
I think it's better to, I think it's definitely better to think about that, because when you think about the violence, you think about the ways that somehow little children who don't know the difference will play with each other, and by 10 or 11 years old, they're ready to fight people that they don't know anything about just because they look different. The treatment of the children who are born with an open cleft, and how they have to be kept away from the other students in different places where they live because they couldn't get the medical attention to repair it. Sometimes when you think about the ills of society, you probably can't breathe. But in the end, we are the same society that you hear these wonderful stories about people jumping off the subway tracks to rescue other human beings, people running into the World Trade Center who never came out to rescue the people who were trapped there. And I think somewhere, if we can try to instill that kind of valor in the younger people of tomorrow, maybe they'll be able to breathe a little easier than we can today.
Then we had a follow-up comment question from Dr. McGarvey. It seems to me that one of the points of resistance from whites to any meaningful change in structural racism is sensitivity to being expected to feel guilty about slavery, etc. James Baldwin was very clear. He was not calling on people to feel guilty, but he was calling on them, us, to accept responsibility for change. Thoughts?
Oh, I think that's really well put, and it's. I mean, you can't go back and what I think is interesting is when I went to the Shem Museum in Jerusalem, the Holocaust Museum, they had pictures of the German leaders up. They had booklets that you could open up and read about them. And I think the reason the history was so interesting is while they were massacring people in concentration camps during the day, they went home and coached soccer for their children at night. These people were not monsters that came from another planet. They were people who grew up down the block from people they eventually slaughtered. And I think that to some degree, preserving some of the negativity of history is in many ways good. Now, I don't like the idea of keeping the statues of Confederate generals that were built in 1960 by governors like George Wallace. I don't think they should have been built in the first place, and they should be ripped down. But the statues that have their historic place, I think, compel us to be different from them. So really, to the meat of the question, it is a matter of taking responsibility as Americans for what other Americans did, and it wasn't all of them, but it certainly was enough of them that it went on for 244 years in segregation, for another 101 years after that until the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964. So I think that the way to really to see this is that there were people, they did a lot of great things, but they also created a lot of great harm. We are their successors. We should make it right.
And then we have another comment says, thank you, Governor, for a very educational forum. History is my favorite subject. My question is, what does the governor think about the press and Antifa?
Well, Antifa, I think, is very similar to a lot of the organizations in the 60s. They were small, they were adjutants, they wanted to change the whole world, but they couldn't do it without trying to adhere themselves to other struggles. And the book Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison really details that if you ever get a chance to read that. And so I think that, people have a right to their opinion, but the media has highlighted them so much they've created an organization. People go there um, as an alternative to other places that they might go, where at least the message, I think, would be more about reforming the country and not the kind of anarchistic ideas that some of the people in Antifa appear to have. I don't really know that much about them. But the media is always a problem in these situations because they sensationalize the extreme and make the rest of us try to figure it out. I mean, I remember, um, the organizations that would get so much attention because they would make these horrible remarks, and then the question would be who's going to criticize it, who's going to condemn it, and these individuals were laughing all the way to the bank because it was helping their organizations grow. Fortunately, around New York, we haven't had those types of problems for about 30 years.
The next one is a comment that says, friends of mine have found a small public health way to help BLM, handing out masks and hand sanitizer at BLM protests to help limit the spread of COVID. You.
Well, I mean, I think that's great. There were people who marched in the civil rights journeys back in the 60s, and some of them lost their lives, like Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, and Viola Liuzzo, and Medgar Evers. People should not lose their lives because they catch the COVID virus when they were marching for something that was that is just as important, freedom and equality for everyone. But in doing so, we love that the people are marching. We love their participation in this democracy. But we would hate to have to go visit them in hospitals because they came down with COVID. I don't know what is so difficult for people to understand that. Look at all these states that thumb their nose at the medical authorities and opened up their states, and now all of them are having their own individual epidemics. Arizona, Georgia, the state of Florida, the state of South Carolina, all of these outbreaks where the virus started, it started to dwindle and then spiked because people are ignoring that. And for those who are marching at Black Lives Matter protests, I encourage them to go by that station, get a mask, get some gloves, and go out and protest. Believe me, we're going to need as many of you as there are.
Okay. Governor, I certainly on behalf of NYCHSRO MedReview want to thank you for taking the time for a well-presented presentation that you have given to us. I want to tell you that this was the first, you were our inaugural speaker, and it's going to be very difficult for someone to follow you. We had close to 150 people sign in to listen to your presentation.
Well, Joe, I want to thank you. Joe was the one that thought of this about a month back and called up and asked me if I would be involved. And it's very exciting, and particularly from my colleagues at the board, very flattering that I was asked to speak today. I'm, of course, an individual who has suffered from discrimination not only because of my race, but because of my disability. And sometimes what was most frustrating is I knew people in my own race who wouldn't hire me for a summer job when they hired everyone else. And then I knew people with disabilities who I thought were out and out racist. So it just goes to show all of us that we need to really not live in our own bubble other than to prevent the virus. We really need to reach out to get to understand other people and to take their word for some of the stories they tell about things that happened to them, because that could certainly be a contributor in this whole idea of moving from rage to reconciliation. So thank you so much for inviting me, and anything else I can do to be helpful, please let me know.
Just to let the staff know that we are already in the process of planning a follow-up. You will get notification about it, and since this was such a great success, we will continue this program.
Thank you, Governor Patterson.
Thank you, Governor.
Thank you all. Have a good day.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.